On the 28th of April 1996, the historic tourist site of Port Arthur in Tasmania became the scene of the largest massacre ever to hit Australia.
Aussie officials are calling it the worst massacre in over 100 years.
There was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Within minutes, a gunman rampaged through the site, shooting at innocent people.
I've not seen injuries like that. There is such destruction from this sort of weapon.
The mother was carrying the 3-year-old baby when they were both shot.
The scale of the deaths and injuries that was to follow rocked the world.
Those scenes were simply horrific, and I have an extraordinary amount of admiration for everybody that had to confront those scenes on the day.
35 people were shot and killed, and 23 wounded.
I've never been involved in war, but I could think of nothing that would describe an incident such as that inside this place as the product of war.
I felt when I left Port Arthur that I had to do something.
The devastation wreaked by the mass murderer and the colossal change the tragedy provoked makes this a crime that shook Australia.
I was working. I started at 9 that morning because there wasn't many staff on. It was a really busy day.
The picturesque tourist site of Port Arthur sits on the Tasman Peninsula, an integral part of Australian history, ever since the British convicts were first shipped there in the 18th century.
Back in those days, the equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. It was a military reserve. You weren't allowed on the peninsula unless you had business there. It was run by the soldiers and Governor Arthur.
The historic site is relatively beautiful in the sense that much of it still survives. Some of it's been restored. So it has that interesting combinations of trees and plants that you would find in the United Kingdom that, of course, are not native in Tasmania. Port Arthur is always on the list of places to go with anybody that visits us.
On the morning of the 28th of April 1996, Ian Kingston, along with 30 staff at Port Arthur, were preparing to welcome many tourists.
There was a lot of the management side of the organisation were at a seminar on the east coast of Tasmania, Bicheno. And it's how come I ended up here on the day. It became obvious by about 11 that it was going to be more busier than what they predicted. I think we had 14 coaches end up coming in. Car parking was getting a bit of an issue because visitor centres there now wasn't there in those days. Everyone used to park under the oak trees and, you know, it was really limited.
One of the tourists visiting the site that day was Peter Crosswell.
At the time I was the state manager of an organisation called Can Quality. It was a support program for kids with cancer and their families.
Peter's role that day was to look after other people visiting from the organisation. They chose a day out at Port Arthur.
We had one team at that particular time that had developed the program. That were based in Sydney, and they actually come over to Tasmania to do their first tour here. And it so happened that that weekend they'd been here a week, going around the primary schools, and they wanted to go down to Port Arthur. So I took them down there for the day.
Just 3 kilometres up the road from the tourist site, a local man, Martin Bryant, arrived at Seascape, a popular guest house run by David and Sally Martin. As people started to filter in to Port Arthur, Ian, one of the site's support staff, fielded the many vehicles packed with tourists.
I was sort of coordinating parking around lunchtime when Martin Bryant drove in.
Martin Bryant was a 28-year-old man from Newtown, Hobart. Like all the other tourists that day, Ian Kingston believed he was there to have a look around.
Didn't recognise him. He'd been around in the area when he was a kid, growing up, and he was entirely different to what he used to be, like he'd grown up and matured. When he drove in on the day, he wanted to park down near the jetty, and I pointed out to him that he couldn't do that because there was already about 8 coaches there. So he said, "Oh, can I park in front of the information centre?" And I said, "Well, it's better if you park along under the trees, under the oak trees." He wanted to get on the 1:30 ferry. And I said, "Well, you'll have to get a boarding pass from the information centre." He tried to get on the boat, couldn't get on. So he got back in the car and went and parked down in amongst all the coaches where we didn't want him to park anyway. I watched him do that. He sat there for half a minute. He got out of his car. On the back seat of his car, he had like a golf bag type of thing, big bag. I saw that as he drove in. Anyway, he mucked around the back seat, got this bag out, put it on his shoulder. Anyway, I didn't really take a lot of notice of it. Then he went in the boot and he was mucking around in the boot of the car. That took him a couple of minutes, fiddling there, doing whatever he had to do. Then he walked up to the cafe.
The Broad Arrow Cafe was situated just up from the car park and the water's edge, across from the main penitentiary ruins.
He went in the front door and he was probably in there for a few minutes. Might have been 10, 15, something.
As Ian continued to help other tourists, Bryant ate his meal on the deck and then went back inside. What was to happen next would change Australia forever.
And all of a sudden, I hear this bang, bang, bang. I could see dust coming out of the building from where I was looking. And I thought, what's going on? I started to make my way up there. It's still going. I thought, God, must be a bloody electrical fault. Anyway, I ran in the building, and as I went in the door, there was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Tasmania's main tourist attraction, Port Arthur, is under siege. Ian Kingston, one of the staff members, has been helping tourists throughout the morning as the site gets busier. After hearing loud noises from the cafe, he rushes to investigate and could never have prepared for what he was confronted with.
I got inside the building and there's Bryant standing with his gun, and beside him over a bit he had his big bag that he had on his back, and I could see in the bag that there was another gun of some description.
Ian faced an unprecedented situation. Martin Bryant had opened fire with a semi-automatic weapon in the busy cafe. giving the innocent customers and staff little time to react. Peter Crosswell was also there with his party.
You can't comprehend. You're sitting on this beautiful April day, it's quite cool, sitting down for a cup of coffee, and then somebody starts coming and shooting people. It doesn't make sense.
The cafe and adjoining gift shop were crowded with more than 60 customers and staff when Bryant opened fire.
It takes time to react to it. You can't think it through, you just react to it. And some people reacted by running, other people reacted by hiding in cupboards.
As the cold-blooded killer indiscriminately shot at anyone in his path, Peter made the split-second decision to try to shield his colleagues from the gunfire.
I reacted in a different way. It's not a weakness, not strength. It's just the way you react, given that. And a lot of the people that were killed were older people. They didn't have the reaction time and they were virtually shot where they were sat.
As Peter took cover and the gunman continued his rampage, Ian Kingston witnessed the horror from the doorway.
There was a person to the left of me. They went to move and he turned around and shot the guy. And then while I was there, this chap behind him, he got up and moved his chair and he turned around and shot two more people then. While he had his back to me, I got out.
In the space of just 90 seconds, Martin Bryant had shot and killed 20 people, injuring a further 12. As Ian rushed away from the cafe to warn others and get them to safety, some tourists hadn't yet realised a killer was on the loose.
By that time, we had a couple of coachloads of American tourists, and they thought it was just some sort of a show. And they were all flocking from out on the oval and all around the whole site to see what was going on. And like I was sort of didn't know what to do.
With no signs of relenting, Bryant continued shooting in the cafe and gift shop.
I got as many as I could together in the bunch, and we started to make our way up through Government Gardens past the fountain to the parsonage. That's where I was bringing them to, so it was pretty safe.
As Ian desperately gathered as many people as he could to run to safety, the gunman started to move outside, where many unwitting tourists still had no idea what was happening.
It's gunshots, live action here at Port Arthur.
I looked around and I saw him come out of the cafe, and he came out and he shot a couple of shots across over the oval towards the penitentiary.
Tourists and staff tried to take cover as the cold-blooded killer headed back towards the car park. In just seconds, he took aim at people as they ran for their lives or hid for safety on the parked vehicles. Nobody was spared. Meanwhile, Ian Kingston could see the tragedy unfold as he battled to get his group to safety.
We were bringing all these people up to the parsonage and we had the Mikacs with us. She decided she didn't want to be part of our group. It was too dangerous. She was going to leave the site. Anyway, at that point I saw him come off the bus and I said to her, stay with us, he's getting in the car. No, she said, I'm going to run up the road.
The Mikacs were a young family. Nanette and her two girls, Madeline, aged 3, and Alana, 6, visiting the site that day. Despite Ian's desperate pleas, Nanette was frantic to get her children to safety and took the decision to try and escape alone.
The Mikacs, they wanted to go home, and that was where we lost them. They just veered off and unfortunately went the wrong way.
As the family ran out of Port Arthur, Bryant also made his way off the site. he had just shot at 11 innocent people in and around the car park and jetty. The carnage and devastation left many severely wounded and others dead.
Got in the car, drove out, headed up out of the site. At the top of the site there used to be the toll booth was there where everyone paid their money. He's about halfway up and he started shooting. I thought, oh, he's probably shot the kids and all that.
Ian feared for the safety of the Mickacs. Having made the decision to leave at the same time as Bryant, they were right in his path. The gunman drove up to the family, just a few hundred meters from the exit, and stopped beside them, shooting the mother dead, before turning the gun on Madeline and Alana.
How dare someone murder two little kids after murdering their mother and chase one of them round a tree to kill her? It just beggars belief.
The enormity of the massacre was now unparalleled. A lone killer had started a callous rampage with apparently no motive. Now more than 20 people lay dead and over a dozen wounded. And the nightmare didn't appear to be ending. On seeing the brutal killings of the Mickacs, other tourists quickly hurried to get out of Bryant's path, warning anyone they could to turn back. By now, the gunman was already back in his car and making his way to the toll booth.
At that point, I heard some more shooting on top of the hill. I rang the toll booth. Aileen was in there, and told her, lay on the floor. She said, all the money, we're counting the money. And I said, don't worry about the bloody money, just get down because he's coming back. So she just laid on the floor.
Martin Bryant had in fact murdered 4 friends at their car, pulling their bodies out of the vehicle and into the road before stealing it. The killer then drove to a local service station, targeting another car that was about to leave. The couple in the vehicle had no chance to escape. The female passenger was shot as she tried to flee, whilst the man was forced at gunpoint into the boot of the stolen car. Bryant now had a hostage. An unprecedented tragedy has happened at Port Arthur in Tasmania. A lone gunman has opened fire at the popular tourist attraction, shooting innocent visitors and staff. Dozens lie dead and severely injured as the killer continues his rampage out of the site and along the road at a service station.
What happened was that after Bryant left and continued his shooting rampage up the road, you could still hear the gunshots.
And the gunfire could be heard across the site as Ian rushed to get his group away from the danger.
Yeah, the parsonage would be about 300 metres from the cafe. It's the longest 300 metres ever I've walked in my whole life. It was a bit of an issue to get everyone up there as quickly as we could. As the afternoon went on, the whole phone network got clogged. It was hard, and it was hard trying to pacify visitors that were here that couldn't ring out. Couldn't get a line, trying to tell people their families overseas, they're all okay.
As the survivors waited for help, Bryant was still on the loose. After taking a hostage prisoner in the boot of his car, he drove to a place he had already been to that day, Seascape Guest House. By now, emergency services had been alerted to the tragedy and were rushing to the numerous crime scenes unfolding. Terry McCarthy was a trained negotiator with Tasmania Police.
The initial call I got was extraordinarily brief. It said something along the lines of 20 dead at Port Arthur, get here now. My initial task was to try and make contact with Seascape to establish who was there and perhaps ascertain what was going on.
Whilst officers were getting into position, news of the horror was filtering through to forensic psychiatrist Ian Sale.
I heard vaguely this news flash about shootings.
At least 200 police have surrounded Port Arthur. All roads in have been blocked.
I thought, my heavens, it's happening here. I knew because I'd done occasional call-outs with the police negotiator squad. I got a telephone call from a police officer I know to ask if I could come in and lend a hand.
Information was now trickling through to Terry and Ian about the enormity of the killer's rampage. At this point, they had no idea of what to expect from this gunman. He had already callously murdered dozens of people and showed no signs of stopping.
He talked about a vehicle that was burning on the property and sort of kept asking, why aren't we doing anything about it? And it was like he'd set that fire to force police to come in to investigate what was going on. And of course, he'd set himself up to ambush those police officers should they go in there.
With a burning vehicle in front of the building, Terry had to be mindful not to rush in and put officers' lives in danger. The police also faced another challenge.
Two of my colleagues were stuck in a ditch across the road under fire, and part of my role, of course, was to keep Bryant occupied, engaged in conversation so that some sort of action could be taken to perhaps get those guys out.
The trapped officers had been the first on the scene at the guest house. Unaware of the scale of the danger, they had to take cover as he shot at them from inside the house.
It was difficult to work out exactly what weapons Bryant had. But certainly the vehicle that he'd travelled down to the historic site was subsequently located, and it was established that there were a number of weapons still in the boot of that vehicle, along with a significant quantity of ammunition. So we knew he had access to high-powered, high-capacity magazine firearms, but as to where they came from, we weren't sure at that particular stage. He was able to fire significant numbers of rounds in the general direction of police officers on the ground.
As Terry tried to get any information from Bryant, investigations were underway to try and find out who this gunman was and what possible motive he could have to cause such heartache.
I'd never heard of Bryant before the day. And on the day, the information we got in, they were able to eventually identify who he was, and then they were able to identify family members. But the information that family members gave us was confusing. We were initially told that Bryant had schizophrenia, but the conversations that he was having with the police certainly didn't suggest schizophrenia, and it's not the sort of incident you would expect a person with schizophrenia to cause. But nonetheless, we were faced with that sort of information and trying to make sense of that.
With limited information on this volatile character, the police were desperate to get answers from Bryant and to try and stop any further bloodshed. But Terry McCarthy didn't receive the response he anticipated.
You're expecting a structured conversation and a belief by the other person that they have some goal that they want to achieve, whereas we just seem to be going through motions. It was clear that Martin Bryant really didn't have a plan, and as a consequence of that, the negotiations didn't develop in the direction that one would expect them to develop. So our focus became to establish whether there was anybody in the stronghold with him and to convince him to surrender himself without any further harm.
As the siege at the guest house appeared to be at stalemate, the hours since the initial shootings were passing by, and news of the mass killings was now spreading as medical teams desperately battled to save the victims.
It was about 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon, and my wife told me that the switchboard at the Royal had rung and that there was a major disaster.
Steve Wilkinson was head of surgical specialties at the Royal Hobart Hospital at the time.
We knew that at that stage there were going to be multiple casualties, so we formed small trauma teams. We had to clear out an entire ward of patients that were already there. We had to either send them home or move them out to other wards. We didn't know how many people were coming in. It could have been 10 or it could have been 100. We just didn't know.
With the hospital on red alert, casualties soon started arriving with varying degrees of wounds. Peter Croswell, who had shielded his colleagues in the cafe, was taken in to be treated.
There were a couple of us, like myself and my 2 working mates, who got fragments of bullets and all that type of stuff.
In trying to save his friends and dodge the gunfire, Peter was shot.
The place was so sombre, as you can imagine. It was like being in a morgue in the hospital. It was shocking. But not many people stayed there for very long. I think there was 2 or 3 of us in there for 4 or 5 days.
As Peter was treated, Steve Wilkinson and his team were trying to establish the scale of everyone's wounds.
I've got to say that I've not seen injuries like that. We see gunshots and stabbings from time to time, but there is such destruction from this sort of weapon that, there's just loss of tissue. So, there was a lot of, major sort of surgery required.
Meanwhile, 95 kilometres away at Seascape Guesthouse, the negotiation team was trying to establish if Bryant had injured anyone else inside. David and Sally Martin, the 2 owners, hadn't been seen for hours.
During those limited communications, we heard no sounds of life other than Bryant. And it's one of the reasons you have these negotiations. You're trying to work out what else is going on in their environment.
Bryant mentioned how he was preparing food for hostages, but the negotiators couldn't determine whether he was bluffing or telling the truth. And other information he was providing just didn't add up.
The way he spoke was more like a young teenager rather than an adult male. He was telling us stuff that was completely false. He said he'd been out surfing or something like that, and it was complete nonsense. So there wasn't anything useful happening in that communication.
We didn't establish that rapport because there was no rapport to establish. He was in denial as to what had occurred in terms of he wasn't even making reference to what had occurred at the historic site. He was talking about some fanciful event that he claimed had occurred at another location at Fortescue Bay, which is also on the peninsula. It was like a bad script that he was operating on.
And the situation was about to get worse.
What we weren't aware of at that particular time was that the only phone within the Seascape property was a battery-operated cordless phone. We were aware that he was using that phone, but we didn't have the knowledge that there wasn't a backup landline phone that he could pick up in the event that went flat. So that created some problems for us when, of course, it was apparent that the battery had gone flat. The difficulty, of course, is how do you get a telephone into a situation like that safely?
After hours of attempts to get some breakthrough with Bryant, the telephone line had gone flat. They were no closer to a peaceful resolution and had no idea if the hostages were safe.
When the communications broke down, it was decided that the negotiator unit would move down to a place called Turana, which is about 5 or 6 kilometres north of Seascape. And they set up a operations area there, and various attempts were made to try and get the communication going again with Bryant, but they were all unsuccessful. They weren't able to find a way.
As daylight broke the following morning, the killer had been holed up in the guest house for 18 hours. What happened next was to stun the officers as Bryant made his next move.
The next morning, he decided to set fire to the property.
Port Arthur in Tasmania has just experienced one of the worst human atrocities in Australian criminal history. A lone gunman, Martin Bryant, has walked into a tourist attraction with a semi-automatic gun and shot at innocent people. In an attack lasting 15 minutes, over 30 victims have been killed and dozens injured. More than 18 hours on from the tragedy, the killer is still hiding in a guest house nearby with possible hostages. Negotiators have lost communication after the phone line went flat, and whilst they try to re-establish connection, Bryant changes tack once more.
He'd set fire to Seascape and then was eventually forced out by the fire.
I'm not sure why he did that. I suspect he was trying to have police take some action. That didn't occur, of course, and as a result, I think he found it a bit difficult inside, perhaps getting himself burnt. He was arrested a short period of time later when he escaped from the house.
With Seascape in flames, emergency services rushed to the aid of any hostages that might have been inside, whilst Bryant was taken to hospital.
I personally was keeping an eye on the news, and we saw that the house that he was holed up in went up in flames and that he'd been captured, and so we knew he was coming. We wound up the burns unit to receive him, and he was brought in under pretty tight security. We gave the medical and nursing staff the option of treating him or not being involved in his treatment. He had quite significant burns, and that took a while to sort those out.
Back at the guest house, officials battling the blaze were to encounter more devastation as 3 bodies were discovered. One victim was Glenn Pears, the man he had taken hostage at the service station. The others were David and Sally Martin, the owners of Seascape.
He broke off communication at one stage and said he was going to prepare food for the hostages. But I suspect, in retrospect, that the hostages were dead by then.
Officers were to also discover that Bryant's rampage had begun before arriving at Port Arthur, visiting Seascape on the morning of the tragedy and killing the Martins. But why had he singled those out?
I believe he held a grudge against the people who ran the B&B, and that's probably where it started, that grudge. I suspect that he held them in part responsible for his father's death. The death of his father is probably the central matter. His father committed suicide in a farm dam, and the family say that he was distressed by this. I believe that he suspected that his father died because of a dispute with the people who owned Seascape. I think that's probably the heart of what happened, and it started off as revenge towards them.
Martin Bryant's father, Morris, had previously tried to buy the guest house. Yet the Martins secured it first, allegedly creating stress for the Bryant family. But if this was the catalyst in sending the gunman over the edge, why did he target all the other innocent victims too?
I think that what happened then at Broad Arrow, he expected to be stopped. He thought, just like Hollywood, that there'd be some hero with a gun there who'd cut him down, but it didn't happen. There was no one there. So this was an incident that once it got that far, he wasn't able to stop. It wasn't scripted for him, and I just think it sort of got there by accident. He didn't know what to do and just kept on going.
As Bryant was treated for his burns, Ian Sale and colleagues tried to dig deeper into his background for any insight.
They were able to retrieve his hospital record, and we learned from that he'd recently been in hospital for quite a serious injury in a motor vehicle accident, and they had noticed some oddness about his behaviour, but had been assured by family that he's got schizophrenia. We also went to the house in Newtown where he'd been living, but that was confusing too. He'd been living there with this rather eccentric woman, and the house was certainly eccentric. She was a hoarder and a collector, and that showed in the house. It was a very, very weird house, to be honest.
The woman who Bryant had lived with was Helen Harvey, a friend who had died in the car accident that injured Bryant 4 years before. Her death resulted in him inheriting a substantial amount of money.
For various reasons, he'd come into a lot of money. He was unrestrained. The people who had some degree of control over him, his father, Mrs. Harvey, with whom he lived, they were both dead. It was mayhem because he could do whatever he liked. And he did.
Bryant had in fact inherited an estate worth millions of dollars. But this didn't answer the questions now being raised on how he managed to get hold of the guns in the first place.
As far as I'm aware, Bryant bought one of his weapons through a classified ad. Another one he bought from a dealer who had a shop about 2 blocks away. No one knew that he had these weapons.
Bryant had bought an array of semi-automatic weapons with ease, no questions asked. He held no license or authorization for them. His trail of devastation had ended the lives of 35 people and caused horrific injuries to 23 victims. The number of people left affected by his crime would be too high to count. Days after the mass shooting, the country was trying to come to terms with their loss.
It shocked the nation, it shocked the world, but it really shocked Tasmania. And, you know, people were just numb, I think, for days, weeks and months after it.
I got a message from John Major, the British Prime Minister. He recalled that the massacre in Dunblane in Scotland had claimed 27 lives, and John said he never imagined that within a few weeks the number killed there would be exceeded in Australia. It was a tragedy that, as the days went by, it unnerved the country. Nobody could believe that something of this magnitude had happened in Australia. These are the sort of things that happen in other countries. They don't happen in Australia. What Port Arthur did was to bring home the fact that there were gaps in the gun laws.
The Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, made quick, decisive actions to alter the legislation that was in place on guns.
The magnitude of the tragedy in Port Arthur provided the momentum for change to occur.
The law as it stood meant automatic and semi-automatic weapons were readily available and legal to citizens across Australia, with certain laws on licensing and ownership in place.
I looked at that character and I suppose I had to think, why was it so easy for you to harm so many people? Relatively insignificant character, simple-minded, but just had access to weapons that allowed him to do a heck of a lot of damage in a very short period of time.
The laws were reasonably strict, but obviously they weren't strict enough.
By the following month, the government had made the biggest change in their weapons policy to date, bringing in the National Firearms Agreement.
The agreement was that we'd have a nationwide ban on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, and we'd have strict rules about how you looked after the guns that you're entitled to have. And then we said, well, to make it work, we've got to have a buyback. And that was part of it. And I said that the federal government would fund the buyback. Now, we bought back 750,000 guns.
I take my hat off to John Howard for doing what he did, for having the guts to stand up to the gun lobby. And as far as I'm concerned now, it ought to be a hell of a lot tougher to own a gun.
The timing was certainly right after Port Arthur, and it was the right thing to do. The way they approached it, and they gained a huge amount of support for it.
It has been successful. We've had since that legislation, if you define a mass murder or homicide as more than 5 killed in the same incident, we've not had any since then.
As people tried to rebuild their lives and readjust to the new gun laws, the fate of the man who wrecked so many lives was being sealed.
He wasn't mentally ill in the usual sense. He was fit to stand trial. He understood that he was charged and with 35 counts of murder and sundry other things. At that stage, when I met him, interviewed him at the prison, he was still denying his involvement.
We wanted to ensure that the police case, or the Crown's case, was so compelling and without flaw that we could successfully convict this individual for every murder that he committed.
He didn't change his mind until basically right at the end of the trial. He suddenly decided to plead guilty.
Martin Bryant's plea of guilty was accepted for all of the charges, and the Supreme Court of the day ordered 35 life sentences, and his papers were marked never to be released.
Martin Bryant was remanded in Risdon Prison, Tasmania, where he will spend the rest of his days. But despite the heartache caused, some people were intent on questioning whether he was the actual killer.
A lot of people came in afterwards, and a few of those people, for whatever motivation, came up with a different story.
They reckon, there was 2 gunmen and Wright and Bryan didn't do it and the government set him up and all this crap that was put out. It's all a load of bullshit because it was nothing like that, and I was here, I was in the middle of it, and I know exactly what happened. And I don't know where these stories originate and how they get going. It's just a load of rubbish, you know.
A poignant memorial now stands at the site where the Broad Arrow Cafe once was. A fitting tribute to all those affected by the tragedy on the 28th of April, 1996.
The Memorial Garden's designed for people to go there, reflect, think about things, spend their own bit of time.
The Bryant massacre just adds another layer to Port Arthur. It's horrible, it's awful, but it's not something to keep people away.
I can't help but think the best way to remember it is to recall the fact that out of this terrible tragedy, the country moved forward in gun control. And you can't remember the good without remembering the tragedy. These things are part of our history, and there's no point in trying to airbrush them.
Peter Crossell now is no longer the Peter Crossell 15 seconds before Bryant started shooting. He's a totally different person, and he is a better person. And I convinced myself that that was the case. So I moved forward in life with Port Arthur massacre embellished in here and in here. End of story.
We can't just bury it, pretend it didn't happen, it didn't exist. And those people deserve more. The victims deserve more, the survivors deserve more, the families deserve more. It is part of Australian history, and I think we need to treat it as such.
Derek Percy is an Australian criminal vilified by every person who knows his name.
Police have spent the day interrogating the man they believe is responsible for some of Australia's most notorious child murders.
We're talking about some of the most mysterious crimes in the last century. Percy is a person who has excited a great deal of media interest.
Hitting the headlines over 40 years ago for a crime that changed the very fabric of Australian society.
His actions and the way he dealt with the young girl were horrific.
Maybe it's the first time people started to look at strangers a different way. It was certainly the time when Australia lost its naivety.
The graphic murder of 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey was only the start, as more heinous crimes unravelled, directing suspicion to Percy.
Percy is also a suspect in the disappearance of Adelaide's Bowmont children.
There can be nothing worse than the random abduction and murder of children, of which Percy is a suspect not in one but in several cases.
And would sensationally culminate in detectives questioning him on his deathbed.
Did you abduct and murder this girl?
The notoriety surrounding one of the country's most evil killers, and the mystery that shrouds him to this day, makes this a crime that shook Australia. Derek Ernest Percy, from Mount Beauty, Victoria, is a man who has puzzled officials for decades.
Derek Ernest Percy is one of the most peculiar criminals we've got in Australia.
A criminal who has slipped into the shadows ever since a day that changed history in 1969.
The day, of course, was a Sunday. It happened that on that particular day, we found out during the afternoon that a little girl had disappeared down near Frankston.
The girl reported missing is 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey.
Yvonne Toohey had gone with a friend called Shane Spiller to a beach.
The two young children are in the quaint coastal town of Warneet, Western Port Bay, 55 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. Close to the water, they decide to play on one of the many beaches that surround them, just yards away from Yvonne's home.
Warneet is an area of bushland and beachfront outside of Frankston, not a terribly popular area, and in the middle of winter, July, an area that people don't visit a lot. They drive past it, but they don't stop there too often.
But today, the young friends are not alone on the beach. As they innocently play, everything changes within seconds.
Shane was with the little girl Yvonne when a fellow approached them, grabbed hold of Yvonne and insisted that Shane come to her rescue and threatened that if he didn't come over that Yvonne would be injured.
As the children stand terrified, the stranger tries to also snatch Shane. But the little boy reaches for a small axe he has brought with him.
He was astute enough to pull a little tomahawk out of his backpack and run off.
Shane Spiller flees to get help as his friend is dragged away and into a nearby car.
He signalled down a passing motorist, so he was able to provide a good deal of detail, which is pretty smart for a child under those circumstances.
The search for the vulnerable little girl is now paramount. Officers are relying on Shane and any other witnesses to stand a chance of getting to Yvonne.
He was able to describe the guy, he was able to describe the car. When Shane was asked about the car, the most significant thing that he was able to tell us was that there was a Navy sticker on the back of the car. He was able to tell us what colour it was, he was able to tell us it was a little station wagon, and with the aid of the other passers-by, they were able to give us a colour, and it was described, I think, as a Hillman. Somebody else was able to provide that it had New South Wales plates on, and being in the state of Victoria, of course, that made it much more meaningful. Other witnesses were in the same area, so the car had attracted some attention.
And one particular witness provides information that indicates the abductor is planning to take Yvonne to somewhere secluded.
He came forward and he described having seen a car being driven erratically along a dirt road in that area.
Officers widen their search for the sighted vehicle. As each minute goes by, they fear for Yvonne's life.
I guess it doesn't become much more pressurised than in being told that a 12-year-old girl has been abducted from the beach. Nobody knows where she's gone. She was last seen by a little boy who saw a man holding a knife to her throat. So in terms of pressure, in terms of doing what you do as a policeman, it doesn't get more meaningful than that.
As an extensive search begins, Yvonne's friend Shane and other members of the public provide crucial information, and one clue in particular proves to be invaluable.
There are a lot of people who did a lot of right things on that day, not the least of them being the little boy. The passers-by did the right thing. The first police to attend did the right thing. The first police to attend went to Cerberus because of the sticker on the back of the car.
Cerberus is a naval base 35 kilometres south of Warneet.
The little boy was able to tell police that he saw a little Navy insignia on the back, so the police went to the nearby Navy base.
The sticker that Shane has described on the abductor's vehicle could be an essential clue in finding the perpetrator who has taken his close friend. Officers rush to the location 30 minutes away. Yvonne has not been seen for hours. As they arrive at the base, they discover something that will alter the whole investigation.
When the police first arrived at Cerberus, they quite quickly, with the aid of naval police, found the car that had been described.
But the officers need to be certain it's the same car they are looking for.
People, including little Shane, were able to go to the naval depot and pick out the car from the many, many cars parked in the car park at the naval depot. It was not at all difficult for the naval people to identify the owner of the car. They had the records well compiled.
The owner of the orange estate car is Derek Ernest Percy. As officials try to locate him on the base, his vehicle is searched for any possible clues.
He was a 20-year-old naval trainee. He was an electrical fitter, I think. The naval base at Cerberus is a major naval attachment. It's where young naval officers go to be trained to take on their role in the Navy. And Percy was a cadet naval officer.
It is now vital for officers to get to this cadet immediately to find any information on Yvonne's whereabouts.
They did look to get Percy to the office by piping him, I think was the expression, and he didn't respond. So they went to his barracks, and his barracks mates told the police that he was down doing his washing.
When the police get to the laundry facility, they make a very alarming discovery.
That's where he was when he was apprehended. He was washing his clothes.
They went in, a senior officer tried to stop them, but they burst in and they found Percy cleaning his blood-soaked clothes.
(1969), and 12-year-old schoolgirl Yvonne Toohey has been snatched by a vicious predator from a beach in Warneet, Victoria. After her friend memorises the kidnapper's vehicle, officers have raided a nearby naval base and caught the owner in a very compromising situation.
He was washing his clothes. They probably had blood on them, but he had clothes in the washing machine, so we don't have a picture of somebody standing over a tub scrubbing blood out. It wasn't that graphic, but he was certainly washing his clothes, of course. Police took possession of his clothes, asked him preliminary questions, obviously, as to whether or not he knew anything, and he firmly denied that he did do anything or he knew anything or whatever, but he was taken into custody by the naval police people, and he was isolated until such time as we got there.
By now, Yvonne Toohey has been missing for over 5 hours. The possible blood on the clothes is a very distressing sign, and Percy needs to provide answers fast.
You make sure you got your facts right as best you can. Make sure you got whatever exhibits are available to you at that time as best you can. So with all that in place, that's when we first started to speak to Percy.
And worryingly, along with the blood-stained clothes, more incriminating exhibits have been found while searching his car and private possessions.
We had his clothes, of course, but the most meaningful exhibit was a blood-stained knife that had been found in his car. There were other knives found in his car. There were also sketches of nude children which we'd found on top of his locker. So there were those sorts of things that early pointed to him.
Detectives are now in a unique position. With extremely damning evidence, they must get Percy to reveal what these items are connected to. With nothing pointing directly to missing Yvonne, what would the young naval cadet reveal?
He had all sorts of reasons to believe that she was dead, at worst, or fatally injured. And the only person in the world at that time who could take us there was Percy. And here we were talking to him and trying to get him to tell us, trying to elicit this information from him, and it was very difficult. As we started to speak to him, he was in denial, but in terms of his demeanour, he was very quiet. He spoke in monosyllables. He wouldn't look us in the eye. He was almost tuned out, if you like. He was insisting that he might have done something bad, but he couldn't remember. I can remember Dick Knight and Percy speaking very quietly and very slowly. It was like watching two people trying to hypnotise each other, almost. Dick Knight was a very skillful interrogator. He had the ability to tune into a suspect and to meet him at the right level. He picked Percy. He knew what would work with Percy, and it did work.
After hours of trying to coax information from the suspect, Percy utters these terrifying words.
He kept saying, I might have done it, and I can't remember, and eventually he said, yes, I did kill her, and I can take you to her, she'd be dead.
Despite the breakthrough, Bernie Delaney was stunned by Percy's next remark.
He agreed to take us there, and as a mark of the man, when we said to him, will you take us and show us, he said, yes. Do I need a coat? Will I be cold?
On a winter's night, Victoria Police quickly scrambled to get to Yvonne, who has been missing for over 10 hours. And her family is anxiously waiting for any news.
We had little idea of what he'd done at that stage. So we went to the scene with forensic people, photographers, with an officer from the Navy, with our own inspector. When we got there, Knights insisted that only a couple of us go to where the body was because we didn't want to disturb the scene. So Percy simply took us to where the body was in the headlights of the car, and he showed us the body of the poor little girl stretched out on the wet ground. She was bound with her hands behind her back. She had a gag placed in her mouth which was tied in with a rope. She'd had her throat cut from one side to the other and she'd been disemboweled. He was pretty matter-of-fact about it all. I was close to him during that time and for the days that followed, and his demeanour never changed.
The details of this unbelievably sadistic crime are hard to absorb. 2 innocent children playing on a beach has now resulted in a young girl's life being taken. And the evil perpetrator appears to be remorseless. Following extensive interviewing of Percy in the coming days, officers will discover they are dealing with a criminal whose depraved mind goes beyond comprehension.
Police went back to Cerberus and they found in his possessions certain handwritten documents. We then, of course, had to put to him that perhaps he had done some of these things to Yvonne Toohey, and he admitted yes, he had.
Not only does this young man have the capability to murder in cold blood, but to also act out his extremely dark fantasies. Could there have been any warning signs from his past into this terrifying behaviour?
He was quite a normal young kid, probably a nerd, you'd call him in today's language. He collected stamps and he was top of the school until around about puberty where he started to behave strangely.
Percy was very, very close to his mother.
There is some suggestion that his family started to become aware of Percy's bizarre behaviour at a young age.
But it involved things like Percy dressing up in women's clothing, violently stabbing women's clothing, this type of thing. At Mount Beauty in rural Victoria, where the family was living as he was a teenager, he was known as the local snowdropper, somebody that would, jump fences and take underwear from lines and things like that. So it was all quite bizarre, and especially in 1960s Australia.
Mrs. Percy would let the younger brother of Derek do what he liked, but with Derek, she would always say, "Where are you going?" and ask the friends to look after him. She went to the local doctor and the doctor said, "He's just going through a peculiar stage, he'll grow out of it." Well, he didn't. So he killed poor Yvonne Toohey.
Derek Percy admits to murdering and torturing the innocent girl. Yet the legal process that follows is one that most people would not have anticipated.
He was put before a jury of 12 peers, and the trial began. He was charged with murder. He'd pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity.
The only defence that could be run for Derek Percy was the defence of insanity. That is, at the time of the killing, he was insane within the legal concept of insanity. And by the time I came into it, it was pretty clear that there had been a number of psychiatric opinions which confirmed the fact that he was insane at that time, in their opinion. And so I took the trial on the basis that's how it would be run.
Percy is assessed by a number of psychiatrists to determine his mental state.
There was a tremendous amount of material available to them because of his past history and his behaviour and the diaries that he kept. All of that was horrific stuff, but it was very important for the psychiatrist to examine all that. So there was a lot of psychiatric material. All the diaries and all his descriptions were all exhibited and read to the jury, and it was pretty horrific. In fact, my memory is that I think one of the jurors fainted during the opening address by the prosecutor. It was a shocking case. At least, from memory, 2 or even 3 psychiatrists expressed the view independently of each other that he was insane within the meaning of the law.
The disturbing content of Percy's private possessions discovered after Yvonne's murder reveal an extremely alarming insight into his macabre mind that officials now know have stretched beyond his imagination.
I can remember saying to somebody one day that a person who would write something like that has a problem, but when he lets you know that he's capable of carrying out, society has a problem.
The content of the fantasies Percy has written down are too graphic to detail, but one obsession shows the extent of his depraved mind.
He had a fascination with his own feces, and what made him even more unique was the fact that he involved his victim in that fascination. And a number of psychiatrists have said that in world terms that's very unusual for a person who's a coprophiliac to involve their victims in that predilection. It just shows how unique he is in world terms.
This is just one aspect of Percy's psyche that leads experts to believe he is not of sound mind.
In this case, there was no rebuttal evidence. No psychiatrist was prepared to say that he was not insane, in other words.
Percy may have fully admitted to murdering Yvonne, but the outcome of this unprecedented trial marks a unique point in Australian criminal history.
The jury deliberated for quite considerable time, but finally came out with a verdict of not guilty on the ground of insanity.
Derek Ernest Percy, a 20-year-old naval cadet, has just been found not guilty of brutally murdering 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey. Despite confessing to the killing and taking detectives to the crime scene, he has pleaded insanity, and the jury have agreed. Now he is to be remanded under a different legal system.
In those days, the result was that he was to be detained at the governor's pleasure.
That is not a life sentence. It can be reviewed. And there have been a number of cases where people who've committed horrible crimes because of mental incapacity or psychotic episodes have effectively been cured.
No minimum tariff is set on Percy's detention. He is sent to Her Majesty's Prison, Pentridge. Yet more than 20 years later, his name comes to haunt the people of Australia once more.
So Percy's in jail, and that's where it would end, except for a young policeman by the name of Wayne Newman, who was given the job of just fixing up an old inquest brief for a little girl called Linda Stillwell, who had gone missing from the St Kilda beach in the late 60s. And Wayne started looking at the case. Slowly and methodically, he was able to work back and realised Percy was a suspect in the Linda Stillwell case and several other cases around Australia.
A number of brutal child murders and abductions remain unsolved from the 1960s. Could Derek Percy also be responsible for these?
In January 1965, during the school holidays, 2 next-door neighbours, schoolgirls, Christine Shorrock and Marianne Schmidt, took Marianne's 4 younger siblings to the beach. They lived in Western Sydney, and the only way they could get to the beach was by train. They hopped off at the train at Cronulla and they walked up to Wanda Beach, a very popular beach. So the children played in the shallows. But shortly after midday, the girls decided that they would go for a walk into the sand dunes. The younger children were complaining that they were tired, so the older girls made the decision to leave the younger children resting behind a sand dune. They never came back. A couple of hours later, the younger children decided that they would catch the train home and report the disappearance of the children to their parents. The tragedy unfolded the next day when the girls' bodies were found buried in a sand dune by a young man, a passerby, and the two girls had been badly assaulted, sexually assaulted.
New South Wales police question over 10,000 people in one of their largest investigations. Yet still, to this day, nobody has been found guilty of the girls' murders.
It looked to be completely a random attack. But why did the girls go into the sand dunes? They had been to that beach the week before. So police thought that they may have met somebody and agreed to meet up later that afternoon. They were seen with a 16-year-old boy. Now, whether or not this boy was involved, he's never come forward, he's never been identified as a suspect, but he does remain the person most likely to have been involved in that crime.
Officers compiled an identikit image from witnesses at the time and compared it to a photograph of Percy, who was 16 years old, and also had a connection with the area.
Would Percy be a suspect in that matter? Certainly. In fact, you'll find that he had a relative who lived very close to the station where the Wanda Beach girls hopped on to go to the beach.
It did come out that his grandmother lived in the adjoining suburb to the girls in Denniston in Western Sydney, which was an incredible coincidence. But whether or not Percy was there that summer, my investigation in speaking to family members doesn't confirm that.
However, decades later, in 2007, Victoria Police unearthed a stash of Percy's belongings, hidden in a storage unit in Melbourne.
It's a set of material around videos, around other documents, handwritten notes, a whole set of material that we've become aware of has in fact been in that location for 20 years.
Within this substantial amount of material, including graphic drawings and notes, officers discover a map Percy has written on, showing an area near to where the attack happened. But he has never offered an explanation for this. Yet other inconsistencies cast doubt on his involvement. Interestingly, a key piece of evidence in the case could have potentially snared the culprit many years ago.
The tragedy of this crime is that there was a DNA sample. There was a sperm sample located on one of the girls' clothing. Over the course of time, and this is years before the advent of DNA technology, the sperm sample was mishandled and did go missing.
Christine and Marianne were murdered in broad daylight more than 40 years ago, both just 15 years old. Their horrific deaths remain a mystery to this day. Just 1 year on from the killings, Australia would be rocked by the disappearance of 3 siblings, the Bowmont children.
The disappearance of the Bowmont children in 1966 from a South Australian beach changed Australia, changed the way Australians parented. From now on, it was the end of innocence. Parents now kept a very close eye on their children.
Jane, Anna and Grant Bowmont took a short bus ride to the beach one summer's day, but never returned home. Several witnesses claim to have seen the siblings at the beach with a man.
The fact that there was thousands of people at a public beach, it was over 100 degrees in the old Fahrenheit scale. The children were seen playing with a man between 35 and 45 years old, 6 feet tall, slim build but athletic and tanned. The children played with him as if they knew him. He'd gained their confidence very, very quickly.
Yet despite this detailed information, the children vanished without a trace, and no one has ever been held accountable for their disappearance. Various people have become suspects over the years. Could Derek Percy have been the kidnapper?
When Derek Percy was interviewed over the murder of Yvonne Toohey, he spoke to a school friend who was a constable at the time.
Derek Percy's best childhood friend, Ronald Anderson, joined the police force just months before Percy was arrested for murder in 1969.
Ron Anderson asked him about a number of other unsolved crimes. When asked about the Bowmont children, Percy was evasive and he said, "I was there at the time." Now, whether or not he was, or whether or not he was just saying that to throw Anderson off the track, is not known. During the course of that summer, the children had been to the beach a number of times with their father. Their father had gone to work the day before and he had dropped them off to the beach. So it wasn't unusual, even though the children were only 9, 7 and 4, for them to be at the beach by themselves and to catch the bus home by themselves. So this person who did take them from the public beach had gained their confidence either within an hour or two, or maybe over the course of a number of visits to that beach over that summer.
Yet the man described by witnesses was middle-aged. Derek Percy at the time was 17 years old. Despite various leads over the years, the fate of the 3 siblings remains a mystery all these years on. South Australia police still keep the case open. Just 9 months after the Bowmont children disappeared, Alan Redston was brutally murdered in Canberra.
Alan had been tied with a rope and strangled, and his body dumped into a local creek. Now, when police tried to rule Percy out of that crime, it was found out that he was living 400 kilometres away at Mount Beauty. They thought that he may have been in Canberra visiting an aunt, so they couldn't rule him out. Also, one of the bindings that the boy had on his body was a school tie, and because Percy was a schoolboy, that was a red flag as well.
But as investigations continued, the chances of Percy being the perpetrator looked less likely.
It appears that there had been a number of bullying incidents over a number of weeks where children had been tied up. The Australian Federal Police are very confident that they interviewed the person responsible for Alan's death in the early days of that investigation, and that these bullying incidents were linked. His body wasn't affected post-mortem like Percy's other victim.
Australian Federal Police continue with that stance to this day. The violent murder and mutilation of Simon Brooke 2 years later, however, does bear some hallmarks of a crime Percy could have committed.
Simon Brooke was a shocking case. A 3-year-old boy playing in the front yard of his family home on a winter Saturday disappears. His body is found the next day in an adjoining block of land, and he had been strangled, and post-mortem he had been mutilated with a razor blade.
Wayne Newman was able to work out that Percy had been in the Navy, been a sailor, and was stationed up in Sydney. And his trip to the naval depot from his lodgings took him virtually straight past Simon Brooke's house.
He said that he was driving with his brother on the day of Simon's abduction and killing on that same laneway, near that same railway cutting.
Australia's most notorious child killer, Derek Percy, may have been incarcerated since 1970 after the death of Yvonne Toohey. but officials fear he may be responsible for many other unsolved abductions and murders across the country. And the horrific killing of Simon Brooke in Sydney points to Percy in more ways than one.
I found out that there was a boys' home a number of streets away from where Simon Brooke went missing. It's quite possible that the person responsible was scouting for victims among the boys' home when he came across little Simon Brooke playing in his front yard. The reason why Derek Percy has been associated with this crime is because he was stationed in Sydney at that time.
Wayne Newman and his colleagues at Victoria Police spent years reviewing the tragic case of Simon and built up a compelling link to Percy.
A very detailed inquest brief went before the coroner. The coroner recommended that brief to the Director of the New South Wales Prosecutions, the DPP, and the decision was made not to pursue that. There was not enough evidence to lay criminal charges in relation to that matter. So that was certainly a case that we thought that Mr Percy was strongly linked to.
Percy was a fella considered unfit to plead. Doesn't matter what you find out about him, he won't be charged.
Simon Brooke's family have had to endure the rest of their lives with uncertainty. In a recent statement, his father Donald gave his views. Just 3 months after the murder of Simon Brooke, 7-year-old Linda Stillwell is abducted just yards from her house in St Kilda. What connects Derek Percy to this crime?
We're talking about a very naive place in the 1960s. Kids were allowed to go out and play and come back at dark. And the little independent girl went across to the beach to play, as lots of kids did, but she didn't come back.
After playing with her siblings, Linda chose to stay near the beach while her brother and sister went home. When they went back to find her, she had disappeared.
Linda Stillwell is a lot like the Bowmont children. We have no crime scene, we have no forensics, we have 1 or 2 witnesses, we have no suspect.
Linda went missing the year before Yvonne was killed.
One of the thrusts was that Linda had potentially drowned. So investigators actually looked at tides and currents, engaged the appropriate experts in relation to that, and a line search was conducted all the way down to Brighton. They had the army involved. They were probing the soil and the sand just to see whether or not a little girl had been washed up. Detectives went door to door, just really to see whether or not had she run away, whether she'd got herself into sort of like any confined space that she couldn't get out and passed away there. They went to the extraordinary length of boarding all ships docked at St Kilda and down in the bay at the time to see whether or not Linda had been taken on board any of those ships.
Despite all of this, police officers at the time drew a blank.
Derek Percy was not even known to Victoria Police or any other law enforcement organisation at that stage, so he certainly wouldn't have been a person of interest at any stage back at when Linda originally disappeared.
Yet years later, when Wayne and his colleagues opened the files once more, they spotted alarming factors that could make Percy a suspect.
The thing that worried investigating detectives in regards to Percy was that he was on leave at the time, he was in the area, he was active, he committed the crime against Yvonne Toohey only 8 months later, and so he had a high propensity to be involved in that case. A couple of witnesses said that they saw a man with a dark complexion. That may have been Percy, we're not sure. Certainly matches Percy's height, he had that gaunt face.
When initially questioned about Linda, after he had killed Yvonne Toohey, Percy alludes to being in the area at the time.
Ron Anderson alleged Percy made comments such as he drove through St Kilda on the day that Linda disappeared, and Ron pursued that and said, well, you know, did you kill her? And he said, possibly, but I can't remember. And I've subsequently interviewed him, and he certainly has not made that admission to me.
However, amongst Derek Percy's belongings discovered in the lockup by police were maps of Melbourne.
Is that the atlas that you used to own? Yes. That you own?
Certain areas, in particular St Kilda, where Linda was last seen, appear to have been drawn on. But when questioned, Percy hasn't shed any light as to why.
Do you recall making the markings on the map?
The case will only ever shut if the person responsible is charged, brought before the courts, or if we find some remains of Linda.
The little girl's family have battled for Percy to be forced to give evidence for many years, at one point resulting in an astonishing story that hit the headlines.
Percy was pursuing costs against Jean Priest for the court action, and in the end, fact is stranger than fiction sometimes, and we wonder if we have a justice system, but the courts found that yes, indeed, Jean Priest, this grieving mother, did owe Derek Percy, an imprisoned man, a killer, somewhere in the order of $80,000 in legal costs. And fortunately, the Attorney General in the state of Victoria, Robert Clark, stepped in.
The unbelievable action never stopped the family's fight. Yet this attempt to claim money isn't the only thing about Percy's incarceration that will enrage the public.
Because he was jailed for the Yvonne Toohey killing, but he was not convicted, then under the Commonwealth legislation, he's able to continue to receive a naval pension. He's been able to be paid somewhere in the order of $300,000 plus in taxpayer-funded superannuation. He's been using this money to invest in shares, coins, stamp collections, this type of thing.
Throughout the years, Percy has attempted a number of appeals to be granted a minimum tariff, all of which have failed. Linda Stillwell's family continued to work with Victoria Police to push for an inquest in 2009. A relentless determination to make him provide information they feel he has known all along.
In recent times, Percy had attempted to be moved from the criminal justice system, from Port Phillip Prison, to the Thomas Embling Psychiatric Hospital. And that, I'm sure, Percy sees as his exit from a jail. Because he can argue that he has been convicted on the grounds of insanity, he should be held in a psychiatric institution, not a mainstream jail.
Ever since his original conviction, much debate has surrounded whether Derek Percy suffers from a psychiatric illness or not.
I don't believe he is insane. I do believe that he is. He has almost full recollection. I'm sure that there are killers that suppress facts and memories in order to survive themselves mentally. For killers like Derek Percy, there may be an ability to suppress memories in order to live with themselves.
And remarkably, when recently assessed once more, the findings were chilling.
The courts here have found that on modern psychiatric evidence that he doesn't have an identifiable psychiatric illness.
In a unique step, Percy was issued with a certificate in relation to the inquest into Linda Stillwell's death. Should he reveal anything, it would not be used against him. He chose to remain silent. And so the enigma surrounding this brutal child killer continues.
I don't think he's necessarily concealing these matters. Maybe he just refuses to allow himself. But there are telltale things in his diaries which indicates that there's still a flicker there.
He was a coward who preyed on children. He can't be forgotten because we need to learn from people like this so that our society is safer. It's much better to be proactive and preventative.
We can only hope that there was only ever one Derek Percy, and there are no others like him.
He's a killer, we know. How many times? We still don't.
Do you want to make any further comments, Mr. Percy?
No. No.
In August 1992, the sleepy town of Bargo near Sydney becomes the scene of the most horrendous crime.
She was so beautiful, I just knew somebody had taken her. I can't believe that another human being would do that to a little girl or any child.
9-year-old Ebony Simpson has vanished without a trace whilst walking home from school.
There's no reason for her not to have come home. We can only assume that something's happened.
It's everybody's nightmare, a parent's nightmare, their child being abducted.
Ebony, if you're out there, darling, and if you can get home or give us a ring.
It's pretty much the worst case scenario.
The fate of the schoolgirl will unfold in the most shocking way.
He knew where she was all the time. He joined the search party.
All that time we were looking for Ebony, and the killer's car is a few yards away. I hadn't heard something as callous as being on the search party to cover your tracks. It disgusts me 20 years later.
The abduction of Ebony Simpson was so horrific, it rocks the foundations of a close-knit community and is a crime that shook Australia. On the afternoon of Wednesday the 19th of August, 1992, pretty Ebony Simpson disappeared on her way home from school.
She went to school, she didn't come home. And she got off the school bus and, you know, she had to walk a couple of 100 yards just up the road. And she just didn't come home.
The tragedy that was to unfold would rip through the heart of a family who had moved to the small town of Bargo many years before to start a new life.
We'd bought an old farmhouse and done that up. We'd been there about 14 years. We'd chosen to live in the country, and the boys at a country school, and then Ebony came along. So it was an ideal life for children and us.
With 2 young boys, Christine and her husband Peter completed their family with the arrival of their daughter, Ebony Jane, in 1983.
I remember when I had Ebony, I had 2 boys, and then I had Ebony, and I just couldn't believe I got this beautiful little girl. Yeah, she was pretty special. She was soft, kind, and we were very close. She was just lovely and warm. It was just really nice, you know, a nice way to live. And we moved to the country so that the kids would have a better life, and then this happened to us.
The Simpsons built their new life on their farm until everything changed in August 1992.
Ebony had a talk at school with the police the day before about stranger danger. She came home and told me. I said to her, if anything ever comes up, you know, in your life, anything happens, you have to come home and tell me, you know. Then, you know, I read her a story, she went to bed. And the next day when she went to school, she didn't come home.
The usual school routine meant Christine met Ebony at the bus stop, just meters away from their house, at the end of the day.
Normally I was always home and I was always there. And we were getting insurance and I was a bit late, and I said to one of my sons, you know, just go down and meet the bus for Ebony. I'll be a little bit late, but I won't be far away.
Ebony's school was only 5 kilometres away from the Simpson home. Her bus journey took 10 minutes, and the walk from the bus stop up to the Simpson farm was just 1 kilometre away. But this last-minute change of plan brought a strange twist of fate.
His bus was late and he thought she was at home, and then I came home and as soon as I pulled up at the house I knew that there was no shoes there. Ebony's shoes weren't at the front door. My husband at the time, Peter, notified the police, rang them, and I went down to the bus stop. And then I went along the road and I ran through the creek and I went in the house next door looking for her, thinking maybe she got scared or something, you know. But she was a very responsible young girl, you know. She was 9, nearly 10 at the time.
I drove out to the Simpsons home where I met with a bunch of other police that were waiting there for me.
Local officers quickly began an action plan to search for the schoolgirl.
The first information I was given was that Ebony had caught the school bus from Bargo School, and she was seen to actually get off the bus at the corner of Arena Road and Bargo Road and started walking towards her house.
Rod Grant now had a possible sighting, but Ebony's movements were still sketchy. As the search for her got underway, further news came in.
An older man come up to the command post. He'd heard that there was something wrong and a lot of police cars, so he come up to ask what was happening. And he told the General Duties Police that his 2 sons had seen Ebony walking home, and just before she got around the corner just near her house, there was a small yellow car with a man with the bonnet up. And the boys waved to her, to Ebony, and she waved back to them, and they continued driving home.
This new information placed somebody else in the vicinity, but police needed more.
Then I went inside and I spoke to Peter and Christine Simpson. Got some background information about Ebony, her normal behaviours. Pretty much wanted to find out, you know, is this out of the norm? And straight away, you could tell it was completely out of the norm. Yeah, because she was a very reliable young girl, come from a good family background, no dramas at all.
And further news is to heighten the growing sense of panic.
Once she got to that car, she didn't make it past that point because there's a couple more houses between her home and where this car was. And so we had a confirmed sighting that she was at that site, so she didn't make it past there. And so then the alarm bells are ringing.
Nine-year-old Ebony Simpson has gone missing on her way home from school. A delay with her brother's bus meant that he didn't get back in time to meet her. Ebony's house is only a kilometre away from the bus stop, but in that short distance, she has vanished. And now, to add to the rising panic, neighbours report seeing her walking towards a stranger's car, but there has been no sign of her since.
I don't know when you let a child get off a school bus. We'd lived there for 14 years. People said, oh, let her get off the bus. All kids should be allowed to do that and just walk round up the corner and home. It's a part of growing up, but, you know, obviously I'm wrong.
Ebony has now been missing for hours. With her family frantic with worry, this news of a sighting of her and a car spotted on her route home, officers were now in a race against time to discover where the little girl could have gone.
At that time, there's 2 tasks, and we had to separate that pretty early on. There's a search for Ebony, and there's also a criminal investigation, both taking place at the same time. So the search was set up as a grid pattern for several kilometres around where she was last seen. Homes and paddocks, dams, bush.
By now, darkness has fallen. News of Ebony's disappearance is spreading through the community and beyond.
There's no reason for her not to have come home. You can only assume that something's happened.
As officers ramp up their search, they call on members of the public to help their plight.
I can still remember what's going through my mind. The priority is just to find her and find her alive. The whole town was volunteering to come and help. Everybody who was anybody, pretty much, was out there looking, searching. So that had to be coordinated because you couldn't just have people running around everywhere.
Police are looking for her, everybody's searching for her. I mean, helicopters were flying above, with sensor lights on them.
As the minutes turn into agonising hours for the Simpsons, buildings and acres of bushland are scoured for any clues.
I think you make anything up in your head that gets you through that time, but I don't think we slept. We just stood there waiting for some sort of answer. They said, she would have gone to someone else's place to play, but she wouldn't do that. She wasn't like that, you know what I mean?
By the following morning, Christine and her family are desperate for news. As more people offer to help with the search, Rod Grant tries to uncover anything unusual during the last few weeks.
I'd spoken with Christine back at the house and I said, had she seen anything suspicious? And at first she said, no, she hadn't seen anybody suspicious hanging around. And then I remembered maybe I should rephrase the question. What have you seen? Have you seen any cars that don't, or people that don't fit the area? And then she said, well, matter of fact, I saw a man parked down near the bus stop in a small yellow car. She said, I think it was a Datsun 120Y.
This was now the second description given to Rod of a yellow car seen in the area.
Christine told me she actually saw that car twice. And from the canvass that we did with neighbours as well that night and the following days, they said that they'd seen the car hanging around for a few weeks, this little yellow car.
I thought he was just some young guy and, his car had broken down, and I went down to get Ebony off the bus and went past him, and I remember looking at him and thinking, I'll pick Ebony up and I'll come back around and I'll see if I can help you.
This vehicle is now becoming a major focus. Rod is desperate to see if Christine's account of this car is similar to the one seen by the two boys who waved at Ebony just moments before she vanished.
I pulled up my notebook and I started talking to one of the boys. He was 13 and his brother was 17. And they started straight away telling me what they'd seen. It was a Mazda 808. The bonnet was up. The man was leaning into the engine bay with something black in his hand. The car's fairly dirty. There's mud splashed up on the near side. And then he said there's patch-up work on it as well. And you can see where somebody has painted. He said it's called yellow ochre. And he told me the name of the colour. I thought, oh my God, this is so much detail.
As a clearer picture is emerging on this vehicle last seen near Ebony, other officers work with her family as the search is scaled up.
Detective Sergeant Cole Pateman and Detective Sergeant Steve Foster, they went out to the Simpson household and sat out there with the Simpsons, and they got pretty much a really, really detailed background about, what Ebony was wearing that day, what she had in her backpack, what she had for lunch, all those sorts of details, all the background of the family, is there any problems?
The police command post, set up outside the Simpson home, has by now become a focal point for concerned residents, extra officers, and the country's media, all desperate to help.
Everybody was given an area to search in their groups. It was the police, SES, Rural Fire Service, and just volunteers from the community. So they all had areas that they had to go and search.
There's a sense of urgency there, people running around and locals walking out to police, how can I get involved, how can I help? People arriving all the time, various specialist units arriving police-wise, a real big build-up right outside the family home.
A couple of police that were coming from Campbelltown arrived late to the briefing, they missed the briefing, and a sergeant there, he told them, they said, well, what's the go, what are we looking for? And they said, well, they described Ebony, and we're also looking for a yellow Mazda 808. And one of the guys said to the sergeant, he said, like that car over there. And the sergeant turned and looked at the car, which was parked at the command post, just not even 50 metres away. He said, if that's a Mazda 808, that's the type of car we're looking for. So, alarm bell started ringing again.
Astonishingly, this similar car was just yards away. But crucially, the officers cannot jump to conclusions. As they hone in on the vehicle, Christine is asked to describe the man she has seen in the days before.
My role at this stage was to do what they call a photo fit, or a Penry ID, based on information that Christine Simpson could provide me with. As you can imagine, she was going through a large amount of emotions at that time, so I had to be very careful with what I did and what I said to Christine. But in the end, she provided me with a brilliant description and a fantastic photo fit that would progress the investigation considerably.
What happens next is to be the biggest turning point in the hunt for Ebony so far.
We couldn't do anything more with what we had, with what she'd provided me. I walked outside, and as I was walking up to the front gate of the property, my boss came down, and I just said, well, this is what Christine Simpson's given me, and he took a step back and he said, oh, that's the bloke we were just talking to.
Wayne had put this picture together at the house. At the same time, the guys realised that we better watch this car and see who comes back to it. They're doing checks on who it belongs to.
One of the policemen came back down to our farm and they said, I think the guy's out the front. And they said to me, we want you to come and have a look at the car. And I went up to the front, out the front of our farm, and I had a look at the car and I said, well, it's similar, but I don't know, it's just a yellow car, you know. But the one thing was that when I saw him 3 days before losing Ebony, he was looking into the motor of the car and it was stopped on the side of the road, and it was a Mazda 808 and the bonnet opened the other way. And I remembered that, and that's what that car was.
The car has a striking resemblance to the yellow vehicle seen in the area, and the photo-fit picture police have compiled from Christine's recollection now looks very similar to the description given by the boys Rod has interviewed. But officers know nothing more. Time is running out, and they have to act fast.
He came back to the car, so they started asking him a couple of questions about the car, where his movements and all that sort of stuff. Then they called Wayne out to take some photos of the car, and he just put this picture together with Christine.
Police waste no time questioning the man about his car.
He was really compliant, actually. He wasn't evasive in any way. He was fairly quiet. John Rain's first priority was, can you open the boot? And he did, because he thought, well, is Ebony still in the boot if this is the car? He was really compliant, he was really calm. So he didn't really raise suspicions, like he wasn't evasive and he wasn't, trying to avoid helping.
Nothing looks immediately suspicious in the boot, but officers know it is essential to get the vehicle to the station for further tests.
I think they said at that stage that we want to use it to take some photographs to put in the media for the news at night, to put, this is the type of car that we're looking for the media. That was it wasn't a ploy, but it was a real thing that we were going to do anyway, just in case, because we didn't want to put all the eggs in one basket.
Measures are quickly taken to tow the car to a secure police garage, where forensic searches get underway.
My role with the vehicle was to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and try and identify any physical evidence that may either put Ebony in that car. It might have been biological evidence, it might have been clothing, it could have been school books, anything. I was looking for anything.
As Wayne Day scrutinises the vehicle for any clues, the owner is eager to help with inquiries and agrees to go to the station to answer any questions.
They go inside into the detective's office and say, what are we going to do? Asking each other, well, as I call it, the hard questions. Do we just go and put it straight on him? Where is she? Because we've still got a missing girl. The criminal investigation at that stage was second priority. The first priority was finding her alive. And he was so cool and calm that they had to second guess themselves and think, maybe he isn't involved, so we'll just treat him like, you know, a witness about his car, ask him where he's been.
Time is now of the essence. The team need answers. But they are still unsure if this man had anything to do with Ebony's disappearance. As questioning gets underway, they learn more about this local, now identified as Andrew Garforth.
Andrew Peter Garforth, born 5/8/63.
He'd only been in the area a few months. He and his wife had moved to the area. Prior to that, he came from Western Australia. So there really weren't any alarm bells about this guy living in the community or being a threat to kids in the area. Just totally out of the blue, as far as everyone was concerned. And he was married with 2 children. And, you know, lived up the road and hadn't been in trouble locally, as far as we know.
With little information on this 29-year-old, the detectives are eager to find out if Garforth has anything to do with Ebony's disappearance.
He just starts asking him questions about what his movements were.
Went to the hardware shop, bought 2 bolts.
He gave an account, pretty much that he'd been to the video store at Tarmore.
What time was it when you left to go to Bargo to the video store? Yeah, 3:45.
In his account, he avoided saying that he went along Bargo Road and Arena Road.
I drove down Pheasant's Nest Road, turned left onto Nightingale.
Because that would have been the most direct route that he would have taken if he was going into Bargo to return a video or to go to the shop. So after a few more questions, Detective Pateman was just thinking what next to ask him pretty much, and then he goes over the version again. Can you just give me that again? And then he gives a whole different route that he took.
And left onto Arena, right onto Bargo.
Arena Road is the last place Ebony was seen. Garforth's change in his account immediately raises their suspicion.
I'm pretty sure he realised that his movements could be checked about the times because, one, we could have spoken to his wife what time he left, the people at the shop, the video shop.
How long does it take you to drive from your home at Pheasant's Nest to the video store at Bargo? Roughly 10 minutes.
Officers have only been questioning Garforth for 15 minutes. Nobody could have expected the next words he was to utter.
And when the young girl was walking past the car, we grabbed her in the boot.
Over 300 people have now come together in the search for missing schoolgirl Ebony Simpson.
Well, there's nowhere else I can really look because I've searched all the houses around here, most of their properties and that. She'd only get into a car with someone she'd known.
A yellow car on the police radar has been parked just yards away from the command post for most of the search. Officers waste no time in questioning the owner.
Went to the hardware shop, bought 2 bolts.
And could never have imagined what is to unfold.
He starts with, I drove along Bargo Road, I turned onto Arena Road, I stopped to put oil in my car.
I had the bonnet of the car up, I had the boot of the car open.
I was putting oil in the car when the girl walked past.
And when the young girl was walking past the car, we grabbed her in the boot.
the detectives are led to believe Ebony never made it beyond the vehicle.
I drove away.
And where did you drive to?
Down Arena.
Now Garforth is calmly reaffirming their worst fears.
And what did she say to you?
She asked me if I was going to let her go, and I said I didn't know.
With this horrifying admission, they are one step closer to uncovering her fate and are now desperate to discover her whereabouts.
He drove Ebony to a bush track down not far away. He went to the back of his car, got some speaker wire, and he tied her hands behind her back and her feet behind her as well, and then tied her feet to her hands. And he just picked her up and threw her in the dam.
I really don't know what my emotions were at that moment in time. I suppose my main concern is, well, we need to try and locate her in case she's still alive. That's probably the most important thing at that stage. There was no mucking around. It's in the cars. Pack up and get to this location.
It is now 11 p.m. Ebony has been missing for over 30 hours. The alert goes out to get to the scene of the crime as quickly as possible. With Garforth willing to show officers the location, they rush to just 6 kilometres from Ebony's home, praying they will find her alive.
We walked up to the dam, and it's something that sticks with me forever, and I get goosebumps talking about it, is walking up over the top of the lip of the dam and seeing the pink lunchbox floating on the water, and the water was like as still, no wind, no movement at all. It was just like glass. As soon as I saw that, I knew she was in there. And we couldn't see her on the banks or anything like that. And yeah, that was probably, it was disappointing. But mind you, with the temperatures in the area at that particular time, she probably wouldn't have survived anyway if she'd been into the water and then come out. She would have been, just the exposure probably would have killed her in any case.
There was no chance that Ebony was still going to be alive because there was no sign of her when she was still in the water, so they could tell that she was thrown, 8 to 10 metres in. There's no way she could make it, and the way she was tied, no way she could make it to the bank.
Ebony Simpson has died at the hands of her brutal attacker in what appears to be an utterly senseless crime. Andrew Garforth stood at the water's edge, describing his actions to police with no remorse whatsoever. Whilst the police and rescue teams have the painful task of recovering Ebony's body, officers are sent to Christine and her family to deliver the heartbreaking news.
I think it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, the police came, and they'd sent 2 really young policemen up to tell us, and they weren't equipped, And I just remember falling onto the veranda saying, I've got to hold her, let me hold her, She might come back to life if I could hold her. They said, you can't do that.
Nothing can prepare Ebony's family for the other news that is to follow.
In the next interview, he went on that there was more. He actually said that he sexually assaulted Ebony.
I took her up onto the bank of the dam, tied her hands and her feet, pulled her pants down around her ankles, sexually assaulted her, picked her up and threw her in the dam.
I couldn't clean my teeth. I couldn't get out of bed. If it wasn't for my 2 sisters coming and bringing food and feeding my other 2 children and telling me to get up and have a shower and do this, do that. I mean, I was a moron, I was a zombie. You know, I just sat and stared. Well, nothing means anything anymore. I mean, all the things about life, you know, that are so precious has just been ripped away from you.
The sexual assault and murder of this defenceless little girl soon shook the whole country and provoked a fierce reaction.
There was community outrage very quickly. From the moment the matter was scheduled for court, there was a large gathering of locals were out the front of the court, and everyone was wild, ropeable.
Keep looking over your shoulder, buddy.
Yelling abuse at Garforth.
We'll tie his arms and legs and see how he goes. Come on, get him here now.
You know, you filthy so-and-so, you die, you pig, and, you know, hang him and all this sort of stuff. It was real lynch mob stuff. And you couldn't blame them. It was the community venting.
Police waste no time charging Garforth with murder. After this initial appearance, the trial is set, whilst further evidence is gathered, and Ebony laid to rest.
The image that will stay with me for life, apart from the facts of the story, but the image that will stay with me for life is seeing that little coffin. As adults, you go to funerals, you say goodbye to your loved ones, but this wasn't an adult coffin, it was a child's coffin, and that was someone saying goodbye to their child. That there's a little girl who was so brutally murdered and didn't deserve it, and the community was saying goodbye to her.
For the Simpsons, their fight is only just beginning. With a trial to face, they are to never imagine the further pain they will endure.
This man's raped and murdered my daughter. He's a pedophile. The legal system will step in and everything. No, it doesn't. I believed he'd just get locked up for life, but it's not like that. When we were going to Court Darlinghurst for the sentencing, they said he'd get 14 to 20 years. I said, not acceptable. I said, that's not acceptable. I said, you can bring back the death penalty, lock him up for the term of his natural life, or I'll get a hitman and blow him away. And, you know, I wasn't joking back then, and I'm still not joking today.
Garforth's unspeakable actions are hard enough to bear, but additional news is to come to light about his movements after he had brutally murdered the little girl.
The perpetrator, the man who'd done this to Ebony, had been up and joined the search party and walked all over our farm, and he knew where she was all the time.
Nine-year-old Ebony Simpson has suffered the most tragic death at the hands of a local paedophile. Missing for over 30 hours, the murderer has calmly admitted to abducting and sexually assaulting the schoolgirl before callously throwing her into a nearby dam. The details of her fate are almost too much to bear, but as her family tries to process the news, they are to endure even further heartache.
They filmed the briefing taking place, and I still remember the footage of Andrew Garforth standing smack bang in the middle of all the people. There's, I don't know, probably 50 or 60 people standing there having their briefing about to move out to where they were going to search. He was just standing there, standing smack bang in the middle of it.
He joined the search party. I mean, when I think of that today, it makes me nearly sick, you know. We were looking after the person who knew where she was and had already killed her.
How callous can you be to murder a little girl like that and then pretend to search for her? Obviously, it's come out now, or suggested that his Garforth's wife convinced him to join the search party, do the right thing, do the community thing, and, you know, he's masqueraded as a searcher for his own victim. That's just unbelievably callous.
As Christine and her family have to consider life without Ebony, they spark a nationwide change in the way victims of crime are dealt with.
We tried to get counselling and nobody wanted to take us on because it's, I guess, you're too hard. How are you going to counsel a family like us? What are you going to tell us? You know? You're going to tell us it's all right and we'll be okay, and if we just do this, that and the other, things will be fine.
I got a phone call from Peter, Ebony's father, and he was really very angry, and he said words to the effect of, you know, everyone else is getting counselling here. We haven't had a phone call from a counsellor. They really wanted something which they deserved, some decent support, professional support, help with their two boys, help with each other.
You got one person in that crazy system in there that just follows the book. You got one person who stepped outside the boundaries, and that was John Merrick, you know, and you don't get that very often.
And I can't remember how the idea first crystallised, but it was something like these people might benefit from actually speaking to someone who's been through maybe a similar experience. And there was an old bloke, Gary Lynch, who was the father of Anita Cobby, who was murdered some years prior.
So he introduced us to Anita Cobby's parents, Gary and Peg Lynch, and John and 4 other social workers from Glebe, Coroner's Court, and we got together, and that's how the Homicide Victim Support Group was started.
The Homicide Victim Support Group was formed by Christine, John and a small group of people who sadly have one thing in common. Their initial aim is to help each other and those in similar circumstances. As their work gets underway, Andrew Garforth's highly anticipated trial falls just weeks after and uncovers further evidence towards his guilt.
As it turns out, we had some really, really good evidence. Palm prints on the inner guard in the boot. I was able to interpret that, which had the child in the car. Was able to reveal finger marks underneath on the underside of the boot lid, and you could see where these hands were scraping on the underside of the boot lid.
The shoe prints in the mud matched to Ebony's shoes. His shoe prints that we got off him on the day. There was blonde hairs in the boot, and he was wearing a woolen jumper. He had a grey woolen jumper. There was one of her hairs on that, or a couple actually, on that jumper. There was a strand of wool from his jumper on a branch at the dam. There was DNA evidence that we obtained from Ebony's body.
All of this extra detail is hugely compelling and weighs heavily in favour of the prosecution. But Garforth himself makes no attempt to plead his innocence.
We didn't need to use all that because he pleaded guilty straight up, pretty much straight away. He pleaded guilty straight up and he was given life in jail.
"11 months after her murder, Ebony Simpson's killer is handed a sentence that will see him die in jail.
Garforth said to his wife, "I'll see you in 14 years." I thought, over my dead body.
The fact remains that Ebony Simpson got the death sentence, the Simpson family's got the life sentence, and Garforth's got bed and breakfast.
He knew the system. He'd been in the system all his life. He knew he'd probably get 14 and be out in 8. So that's how confident he was that he'd played the system over the years. I think people need to understand a lot of this because it's the people who can change the system.
Garforth is familiar with the law, having previous convictions in other parts of Australia for minor crimes. This time, his sentence will match the severity of his crime.
He was one of the very first people in New South Wales to get life, meaning life. In the past, life had meant 20 years or so, but here he was one of the first ever in New South Wales to get their newly legislated life meaning life, and without a shadow of a doubt, and there was not one person in New South Wales, I suggest, that thought he wasn't deserving of it.
Garforth will spend the rest of his days behind bars for snatching Ebony from a roadside and killing her in cold blood.
I think they think when you go to court and come out and then you just get on with your life. Well, it's not like that, you know? There seems to be, there seems to be a lot of rehabilitation for the perpetrators of crime, but there's no rehabilitation for the victims.
In response to her experience, Christine channels her energy into making major changes for victims of crime with the support group.
Well, I think I took all my anger and turned it into something positive and set up Ebony House, first recovery centre in the world for homicide victims. So I burnt up all my angry energy into positive, you know, and I didn't know what else to do with it. Made a lot of changes and very powerful back then.
As a tribute to Christine's daughter, in December 1995, Ebony House is opened for anyone affected by the murder of a loved one, as a place to be able to grieve in private. The support group also goes on to make historic changes.
Police are being taught now at the academy by the homicide victim support group and other folk how to best respond to families, what to say, what not to do, you know, correct procedures. Now that was a real change. Police are very involved and intertwined from the outset with the families and providing them information, updates, details as well, without compromising the investigation as well, without giving stuff away. We've had sentencing submissions and victims' impact statements have made a huge difference as well for families because they feel as though they can be listened to and explain in very personal terms what the murder has meant to them.
I don't think you can make great changes if you haven't felt the pain. It's the pain that drives you. You can feel empathy and try to understand, but you can't feel that power of that wanting change unless it's happened to you.
As the Simpson family has tried to continue with their lives, Garforth has contributed to their ongoing pain since his conviction.
He claims he was bashed in jail, and at one stage he claimed to have lost hearing in one of his ears, and he actually, in many people's eyes, had the cheek, tenacity to apply for victims' compensation. Initially he was successful in one of those claims. I think fortunately it was reviewed and overturned, and then the money was offered to charity.
He crossed the lines of what's acceptable with society, you know, and when you cross those lines, and they're precious lines with children, you can't come back into society. You've already isolated yourself. You're not worthy of living in here, around children or women or anything else, you know, so keep him where he is. It's the safest place for him, trust me.
The counselling for Christine and her family was to span many years, and the effort channelled into the victim support group brought about many milestones and legal changes throughout Australia, one of which guarantees that Garforth has no further rights to appeal his sentence.
We changed a lot of things and that was good. But as I've got older, 20-odd years down the track, I have to say the pain's still the same. I'm happy with what's been done, but I've learned to put it somewhere, and I have built a nice life. Doesn't matter what you do in your life, and I've put my life back together, I think, pretty well. But there's a part of my heart that's broken and I can't fix it. You know? And it doesn't matter how many years go by, how much I talk about it, I can't fix it. And I'm angry about it, you know? I'm angry about what happened to my daughter. I don't want to have people tell me that I shouldn't be angry. I damn well should be angry. A man took my daughter's life and ruined our family. I'm angry, all right, you know. And it's just this stupid system we got out there that says you're supposed to forgive and not be angry. I find it absurd, you know. I mean, if I wasn't angry and upset, I wouldn't be a mother, would I? Put Ebony behind you and move on with your life. No, I'll take her with me and move on with my life. I have no forgiveness whatsoever for what that man did to her. And you can move on. You don't have to forgive to move on. I can see Ebony as plain as anything. She's still 9. I can see her hair. I can see everything about her. I can hear her voice. And no, I can't forgive a person who took that away from our family.